My name is Curt Larson, and I'd like to be your next great product manager. Your first question was to provide an example of a software product I brought to market, hopefully successfully, and I did choose a successful one, and describe the market needs and what differentiated us from our competition and some of the processes that we went through and that I went through to get that product to market. So the product I chose was Viper version 4, which was adding a firewall to our baseline Viper antivirus and anti-spyware. This came in two versions, a standalone consumer version, in other words, you sold it on one PC, and also a business version, which was deployed from a central server out to all the endpoint machines and managed from that central server. I'm going to show you specifically the consumer version, although I was responsible for both. So the baseline task or challenge was to take our Sunbelt Personal Firewall and incorporate those features into Viper Antivirus, in effect creating a antivirus suite and labeling that Viper Premium. Why did we want to do that? Well, the first and foremost was losing sales. Our sales department was telling us with data to back it up that they were losing sales to competition because they had a firewall in their antivirus product. And that's obviously a compelling reason. And then we're getting existing customers asking for a firewall in the product as well, so they could just have one product to control antivirus, anti-spyware, firewall, and so on. And then we had a pretty competitive marketplace, and our main rivals, and those that we were trying to basically encroach in their territory, Symantec, McAfee, and so on, they had a base and a premium product, and in some cases had multi-tiered products. In other words, a base, a mid-level, and a premium product. And so with only one product, it was harder for us to compete against that stacked competition. And then trade publications were giving much better press to those companies that had a suite of products. In other words, more than one, a base product, and then a premium product, or a base, mid-level, and a premium product. And we also wanted to give customers that, do you want version A or version B versus do you want to buy our product, yes or no? Because as we all know, a yes or no can result in a no, whereas A or B more often than not gives or closes the sale. The development model that I used and that we used at Sunbelt at the time was Scrum Agile. And we basically ran this process. From when I got there, it was already starting to be put in place, and continued that process throughout my time there. And basically, following the rules of Scrum, we added a couple of features to the Scrum. We had a hardening sprint at the end to take all the components and put those together and make them all work together. And then as well as it turned out to be a 3-month beta test with Viper version 4, and it stayed that way for subsequent version 5, version 6, and other products as well. And so we found those two essential components to get solid software. A year-long basically development process from start to finish, and I think that covers that. The requirements I went through, basically at the beginning I put together a market requirements document, and that covered the business case and the key product features. So it was basically both a market requirements document as well as a product requirements document. And then on subsequent programs, we broke those up into two separate documents to basically put more detail into the market requirements and the business case, as well as getting more specific and details into the technical side of it with the product requirements document. And then as well, once we had a approved program, we went into a product backlog and took all the features and put it in the product backlog. And in fact, we worked those back and forth. So we had a pretty extensive product backlog over time as we got customer complaints, bug issues, feedback from support, feedback from customers, feature requests, both from our support forum as well as a feature request submittal line. And so we took that, pumped it into our product backlog, took the product backlog, and also put that into our requirements document. So as we defined what the product was going to be, we kind of worked that back and forth. But once we had a completed project and identified what it was going to do, It went from that product requirements document or market requirements document in the case of version 4 into the product backlog and then the release backlog. So basically the release backlog refinement that we did to Scrum, where we said of all these features are in the product backlog, this chunk is going in the next release. And we took 60% must-have features, 40% really nice to have features. And then obviously as time went by, if timing slipped or if we had other features that we had to add to the product, we could trim some of those nice to have features and still have that minimum required feature set to achieve a robust product that would succeed in the marketplace. We documented all those updates in the release backlog as well as in the product requirements document so that we kept track of actually what was going to be in the product and did a pretty good job of keeping track of that all the way through. We had a pretty successful product release with Viper version 4 and then again with version 5. We were seeing 40% year-over-year growth. A lot of that was from a great product. It really hit the market. Our base antivirus, anti-spyware was doing great. It really did deliver on the performance side, which was our competitive advantage. We had excellent marketing that was really well surveyed and hit the target market. Our pricing was very aggressive. We were very willing to cut the price as a closing tactic. And then our sales staff really was pretty good, and I've seen those guys go on to other careers and do really well. So we just had a great team. And the other aspect was having great support so that if we did run into problems, our support guys were all over it. We had a lot of involvement from myself as the product manager, as well as even our CEO was paying attention to what was happening in support. It was not uncommon to get on a call, in a dire case, but to really keep that covered. And our support forums, which were run by support, I was very heavily involved in. So we kept that really well in place so that we were having good customer feedback and good customer interaction. And the other part of that was keeping that support in the US so that people felt like they were really taken care of. Our next question, the most challenging technical decision that had to be made on the project. So really what we had to do was, are we going to build a new firewall from scratch or bolting the existing Sunbelt personal firewall into the new product? There are a lot of pros and cons both ways. Some of the key ones that came up are these here, these 5 listed on each one. We certainly had a industry standard with our Sunbelt personal firewall. It was well received in the marketplace. It was well liked. It was pretty robust. It was basically everything you wanted a firewall to do, and it did it fairly well. The only problem was it was a standalone product, and we needed to incorporate those features into a one-stop antivirus solution. It was proven code. It wouldn't take us as long to incorporate that into our product. And our devs had never built a firewall before, so those were some really strong reasons to use it. On the other side, it wasn't 100% plug-in compatible, so we had to do a lot of work to kind of hook up the plumbing, getting all the components to talk to each other. And same thing, not just plug-in compatible, it wasn't 100% code compatible either, so we would have to do some rework. One of the biggest drawbacks is it wasn't optimized for speed and memory and CPU usage, and especially in conjunction with the hooking it up to antivirus. There was some memory loss and some performance loss, or memory drain and performance loss as we looked at putting those two together. And would it be so the other advantage with the new code was being forward compatible. One of the things that was starting to hit the market and getting talked about was parental controls with the antivirus. In other words, preventing kids from surfing to websites that they weren't supposed to go to. And so as we looked down the road as being able to incorporate that, we wanted to be able to make sure that whatever we did with the firewall was going to work for subsequent product upgrades. And basically, the bottom line came down to performance was our number one priority, and we had to have that. And that really drove having to have a new firewall. We couldn't get the performance that we needed with the existing firewall and with the amount of plumbing that we'd have to create to make the two talk to each other. And really that future upgrade compatibility, we had to keep that performance in place for that as well. So that resulted in going with that direction. So an architecture document for CRM analytics, and basically looking through the requirements and so on, came up with a simple chart, a couple of charts to kind of define it. I could go into a lot more detail. I actually spent a fair bit of time putting this together, and obviously we can go into a lot more. And to do a credible job, I could spend days on this, looking at more details and getting more requirements and inventing, not just inventing, but researching what we needed and coming up with some innovative ideas of how to architect it. But the other drawback is I don't have a good dev to work with on this, and I'd really like to have my lead dev or chief architect work hand in glove with me. And really, it's up to me, it's up to the developers to architect the product technically, and then as the overview and making sure that all the interfaces are in place and all the functionality is in place for what we need from a user standpoint. So here we have a drawing. It shows an installed version client server. In other words, our CRM analytics is installed on a server, and then it's run from a desktop or a laptop. And so we have our base CRMA engine, which does all the work. We've got the UI interface, which interacts with that. We have our database interface, which then talks to each of the databases and does any translation required and any other hookups that are needed to talk to that. We've got some search functionality where we can give parameters and say, hey, I want to do this, I want to know that, give me all these, give me the data that fits these criteria and so on. And I'm sure there's a few other pieces we could add on to that based on what we want to do. And then another email module. So basically we want to have a modularized code base. And so a central engine that basically does the work, the CPU, if you will, and then the other components that hang on to that and talk to that with APIs to make that work. Obviously, we've got to worry about going through a customer firewall to get to a third-party software. So we've got to plan for those protocols to ensure that we don't have any data breaches and we don't leave any holes open for somebody else to get into our organization with that access. And that's always a key concern. Now also was to have it jointly cloud compatible, so a customer could choose either an installed version or a cloud version. And so basically we'd have the same standard architecture, but in this case we would host that on our server base and then have a slightly different database interface that would then work through the cloud or through the internet to access the customer's databases behind their firewall, and obviously get protocols and permissions to access that and keep the security in, as well as any other third-party database that we need for the many reasons that we would need to get that. But that would be handled by that database interface module. And then again, a similar UI interface, in this case slightly different because it's going to be working through the internet to talk to or talk with remote desktops and laptops and tablets even from whatever location to access us and keeping that security in. And then the other components, the email module and the search functions and the other pieces that we would need would be pretty similar and still working with that CRMA engine. And again, working very closely with the dev leads as a product manager. I don't like to dictate, I like to collaborate and get the best solution in place. And so perhaps I'm beating the dead horse here, but keeping those devs and chief architect involved and making sure we're doing what we need to do. Requirements template. So how do we document what's going to happen and how do we keep track of that as we go? So I've in the past created a standard template for a product requirements document, market requirements document, and having all the critical information contained. And basically I've got 5 sections, although it can obviously be expanded as you add detail. But the first 3 sections really document the market and business factors, and then the next 2 sections cover features and technical requirements. And so in this template that I created, I just created a generic Ubermail email client to kind of flesh out and give example, not just say, oh, put this here, but as an example, showing how it works. So these requirements are kind of general requirements that you would have to have for any product, and specifically in this case, installation and upgrades. It's got to be able to install on Windows with an auto installer. The auto installer will be self-contained. iOS, it's got to be available from the App Store, from the Apple Store, and it follows iOS protocols. And Android, it's got to be on the Google Play Store, and it's got to follow their procedures. And if it doesn't have the right operating system, in other words, an older version, the install stops. Pretty basic types of requirements. And then the functionality that we're going to have, like with Windows, you've got hotkeys, hyperlinks, menu highlighting, etc. And so obviously this can go into much more detail than what I'm showing here, but this kind of gives the concept. Tray icons. Are we going to have an icon in the tray for this particular app? How are we going to function with that? What are the platforms that are supported? The operating systems, identifying those. And so basically we're identifying all the different requirements that this product has to do. We've got internationalization or localization. So having different languages, be able to support those different languages. And in this case, I said version 1 is not going to be localized. However, we want to be able to localize that for future releases. And then obviously as business needs drive that expansion, being able to add a language easily. Technical support, troubleshooting, a user's guide, if it's online version, which is what everybody's going to these days, how is that going to be hosted? Who's going to host it, whether it's our company or some other company. All those details will be identified here. Support forum, tech support, how are these things going to have in place? Chat, is there going to be in-product chat capability, or do you have to go to a website to get the chat? And then other release requirements. So basically there's no limit to what you can do here, but just identifying the general requirements. Now here we have the technical requirements. What is needed to go into that product? What are the specific details? For example, 5.02, Ubermail will install in 1 minute or less. That's a technical performance requirement. The install screens are 4 or less, so you don't basically bore a customer to death installing the product. Don't need a reboot after installation, etc. So all the technical details go into this section. And this can obviously be broken out or expanded into subsections to cover like a UI. In the case of CRMA analytics, you can have technical requirements for the database interface, for the user interface, for the email function, etc. And going on to question 5, designing a workflow that associate product managers, those that are working for me, would follow to break those requirements down into their weekly releases. And basically, we're back to Scrum. I'm a firm believer in Scrum. It works, it gets results, and that's what I would follow. And to give more detail to my answer and not just refer to Scrum, basically in the process of creating the release backlog into the sprint backlog, we want to make sure that we break down that release backlog into the amount of work that can be accomplished. And we follow that procedure, and I'll cover that a little bit in the other slides, but basically we want to make sure that it's Agile Scrum over the life of the program broken down into each sprint, and we follow that process just as written in the book. For the sprint planning itself, we take the release backlog. We know our team's velocity, in other words, how many story points can they complete in a sprint on a historical basis. So we select the amount of stories that match those story points. We break those stories down into the tasks. We determine the hours on each task, and then we set the team loose. If we don't have the task broken down far enough into a manageable chunk, we keep breaking that down until we've got that. And so anybody that's working for me would just be able to take that and work with the team to break it down. And again, there's a lot of collaboration with the dev team in taking those stories and breaking them into tasks and getting tasks that they're confident that they can accomplish. So this is basically the planning poker of coming up with defining story points. And this is done at the beginning of a program, done at the beginning of each sprint within the sprint plan, where you take each story and you determine how difficult that is. I have found that developers historically cannot estimate how long it takes to get a particular task or program or project done. But they are very good at identifying how difficult something is or how complex something is. And so if you let the devs put a number value based on the planning poker rules, they can give a pretty good estimate relative to other sections, other components, and other tasks of how tough something is. And those are defined by story points. And they're pretty consistent at estimating story points for each task. And then by doing a couple of sprints, you know how many story points they can complete in each sprint. So each sprint, you can work out how many story points they can do. And then you take those stories that match that number of story points to get done in that period of time, whether it's a week or 2 weeks, and then achieve your end product of getting that sprint completed and then having that releasable code at the end of that period of time. And we really explained this with the previous slide, but getting the right story points to match that team's velocity. How many story points can they complete in each sprint? That determines it. And so the product manager is just basically doing that math. How many story points can they complete? That's how much to give them for the next sprint. Developers break those stories into tasks. They've got this task worked out into amount of hours and making sure that each task is a doable, concise piece of work. And then you just turn it loose. And so, presenting everything in this presentation, I hope this has answered these questions to your satisfaction and given you what you need to know. I got to tell you, this was a lot of work. Whether a short presentation, hours and hours to get there, and I really hope it gets me to the next step in the process. I do enjoy putting these things together, and I hope I didn't bore you to death. And thank you very much for the opportunity.